Hey everyone, this is Stuart, Victor Echo 9, Charlie Foxtrot, and welcome back to our program here on YouTube. And with me today is a familiar face. You've seen him many, many times on this channel, Dave Goodwin, VE3 Kilo Golf. And Dave, welcome back. We got a very interesting topic today on Canadian ham radio call sign history. Oh,
right, Stuart. Well, thanks very much for having me back.
Everybody knows you by now, so let's just jump right into the topic at hand here.
Okay, sure. Happily to do so, Stuart. Well, it actually is, you think this is something that would appeal really only to hams. Nobody else really has a big concern about call signs except us, and it's a very passionate thing with many amateurs. I do have a PowerPoint that'll sort of guide us through this now, Stuart. So just give me a moment here to get it up.
And so while you're getting the PowerPoint ready, so my understanding, Dave, is that this dates back 100 years or so, right? Yeah, obviously you see right there. There you go. Yeah.
So amateur radio licensing in Canada first began around 1920, and I just want to make sure that so it began around 1920, and at that time there were no actual call sign prefixes. So our orientation about call signs really has to change a little bit. At the time, if you were issued an amateur radio license, you were issued a license with a call sign that was a numeral followed by two letters. The numeral indicated, in Canada's case, what region of the country you were in. And it wasn't until 1929 that we had prefixes. So we had this little stopgap thing called intermediates, which I'll go to in more detail in just a moment. So the idea is I'm going to use for frame of reference, my grandfather was a ham. He was first licensed in 1927, and his call sign at the time was 1CB. He was in St. John, New Brunswick, and so he operated as 1CB. And 1 was the numeral that was used for the three maritime provinces, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick, because the regional office in Halifax was responsible for issuing call signs. So they were given 1, Quebec was given 2, Ontario was given 3, the prairies, the three prairie provinces were 4, and the BC, Yukon, and Northwest Territories together were 5. So that was the scope of the Canadian call sign system at the time. And of course, amateur radio was in its infancy then, and this is the distribution that we had. Now, there was a bit of a problem with this, is that you could have radio amateurs in different countries who could have been issued exactly the same call sign because there were no prefixes to distinguish one country from another. So there, my grandfather was 1CB in St. John. There could have been a 1CB in the nearby portion of the United States, or the nearby, a 1CB in France or Germany or so. So this created a situation that radio amateurs had to improvise something to indicate countries in a unique way, and we did it. So what they did in a lot of Canadian amateurs used what was called an intermediate, with the first letter indicating the continent, the second letter indicating the country, and they tried to make this as clear as possible. So I'll talk about that in a moment. But now, so Canada was NC in this improvised system, and Newfoundland was NE. Let's remind ourselves that at this time in the 1920s, Newfoundland was a separate country. It was the Dominion of Newfoundland. It was an equal country to Canada, the Dominion of Canada at the time. So any questions, comments so far? Anything strike you so far, Stuart?
Well, all the research I did on this, Dave, was that prior to the 1920s, when I think it was the IARU or the ITU started to mandate prefixes for countries, it was a free-for-all in the band. We had there was a lot of interference, and there was no way to identify ham radio from maritime to military. It was kind of like a free-for-all on the HF spectrum. And if I correct me wrong, the government at the time, I think this dates back to the early 1910s, or the teens, didn't really see any value in the amateur radio, in the HF frequencies above 3 megahertz.
Yes, actually, the way it worked, I think before the First World War, there was really no licensing of any kind. And it was really just experimenters who would use self-assigned call signs and get on the air and identify themselves, make contacts.
Kind of like 11 meters, right?
Yeah, I guess so, yes. And you're right, there was, and the kinds of emissions that we were using then, for the most part, were quite broad bandwidth emissions like Spark. And so then along comes the First World War. Amateur radio was closed down. Anything except military communications are closed down. At the end of the war, then various countries started going through creating proper radio regulations and licensing processes and so on. So around 1920 or so, we started to have amateur radio licensing in Canada. And so, there was an examination, of course, and a Morse competency test, but it was a fairly easy test at the time. But there were also very few people who were interested in this really leading edge technology for the time.
I imagine like any brand new technology in the 1920s, it was also very expensive to get involved in amateur radio.
Well, you really had to do it yourself. You had to sort of be able to improvise and fabricate stuff. I mean, old car parts and so on would be used to generate some of the spark transmitter, for example. So it certainly would have been somebody who would have had a few extra dollars and a little bit of extra time to be able to engage in something like this. They were sort of amateur scientists of their day.
Yeah, we didn't have the modern super heptagon receivers back then.
Definitely not. It was tuned RF receivers and coherers as detectors, all sorts of strange things we really wouldn't recognize today at all.
Yeah. So now we got this system that ran from 1920 to 1928.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to force it to change?
So there's an ITU conference that took place in 1927, the Washington Conference, where they came out with specific frequency assignments for different radio services. And the amateur radio bands were established then. Some of the amateur radio bands we recognize today, there were bands at 160 meters, 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters, and 10 meters. There's no 15-meter band, no 30-meter band, no 60-meter band. Really, just those bands. There was also a band at 5 meters and 2.5 meters. So for the first time, there were actual frequency assignments dedicated to amateur radio to separate the amateurs from the non-amateur services. And also at the 1927 conference, the ITU established they basically divided up the alphabet and required call signs for amateur stations, among other stations. So up until that time, we used a series of intermediates, and the intermediates they weren't consistently used by amateurs from the reading I've been able to do. But what they did is they just arbitrarily took the alphabet and assigned certain letters to certain countries. And what they would do, I'll give you an example here. In place of the DE, if you're operating CW and I'm going to call you, Stuart, I would send VE9CF, DE, VE3KG. The DE meaning from. Well, in the days before prefixes, one of the options was for people to use intermediate letters between your call sign and my call sign. So in this case, we see 3BP, 3BP, CC, 1AR, 1ARK. That would have meant station 1AR, a Canadian station 1AR, was calling it Canadian station 3BP. The second example I hear is of 3BP, 3BP, CU, 1AA, 1AA. That would have been a situation where American station 1AA would have been calling Canadian station 3BP. It's hard to imagine how this worked, but this is one of the improvisations that people came up with. And then as amateur technology improved, they started using intermediates like C to indicate Canada, U to indicate the United States, G to indicate Great Britain, and so on. And then later, with further improvements to technology, when transoceanic communication became routine in amateur radio in the mid-1920s, they adapted this further by adding a letter for the continent to the front. So in the case of my grandfather's call sign, his call sign still would have been officially 1CB, but he would have used the intermediate NC as a way of distinguishing him as a Canadian station.
Oh, it makes sense. Makes sense. But I couldn't imagine that working today.
No, I can't. Of course, this is when amateur radio, there were very few amateur stations around the world. Many countries with no amateurs at all. This is all, and it really was an improvisation for the times. So along comes 1927, the ITU conference, the division of the alphabet. So Canada got a series of letters allocated to it, and various other countries got a series of letters allocated to them. So what Canada did in 1929 is then they implemented these prefixes, and they used the VE for radio amateurs. So those same call signs across the country from VE1 to VE5 were used, but of course with VE instead of simply the numeral. There was also an allocation for what's called the experimental service. So there were VE9 call signs at that time, but they were not amateur call signs. They would have been broadcast stations. They would have been experimental stations of various kinds, some of which operated and worked with amateurs and some of which didn't. Now, Newfoundland, of course, being a separate country at the time, had its own prefix. VO was used for Newfoundland.
And if I understand correctly, the Victor letter at the front, and I think Charlie and X-ray were allocated to British Empire or British Commonwealth nations, correct?
It wasn't uniform, but many of the prefixes beginning with V were allocated to stations in the Commonwealth and the Empire. For instance, India, VU, and Australia, VK, but not all. I mean, we have New Zealand, obviously a part of the Commonwealth and the Empire, had ZL as its prefix. The United Kingdom had G as its prefix, although it used V for some of the overseas territories. So at the time of 1927, there were prefixes beginning with C that were allocated to Canada, and prefixes beginning with V that were allocated to Canada. Now, of course, Newfoundland was a separate country at this time, and it wasn't until 1923 when the first radio amateur was licensed in Newfoundland, and he was given the call. It was Ernie Ash was his name, as sort of a legendary fellow in Newfoundland amateur radio, and his call sign was 8A. So this is in the pre-prefix period. His call sign would have been 8A, and he would have used the intermediate NE to indicate that he was a Newfoundland. Then in 1929, when Newfoundland implemented its prefixes, 8A became VO8A. And that continued until 1934, when in 1935, the Newfoundland government instituted a system of call areas in Newfoundland and Labrador, where VO1 was the city of St. John's, the rest of the island was VO2, 3, 4, or 5, and Labrador's VO6. And this carried on until 1957, even after Confederation with Canada. So then along comes the Second World War. Amateur radio was shut down. 1946, amateur radio was revived, and the Department of Transport, which I believe was the licensing authority at that time, decided to reorganize the call areas across Western and Northern Canada. So the prairies had hitherto been VE4. In 1946, they were each of the prairie provinces was giving a unique prefix, VE4, 5, and 6. The VE5s that were in BC, Yukon, and Northwest Territories were changed to VE7s or VE8s, depending on where they were. And this is the system that we had carried on for several more years.
Now, are you aware, Dave, back then, if they had the previous call before they got split up, were they able to grandfather and keep that existing call, or did they have to change?
No, they were compelled to change. This is a tougher period of time. It was the revival of amateur radio. You were required to change your call sign. Now, you'd be first in line to get the suffix of your choice. You know, if you had, for example, if you were in Alberta and you had the call sign, VE4 ABC, you would have been first in line to get VE6 ABC. So there was that kind of preference at the time, but you could not keep your old call sign after the change.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yep.
Right. So, of course, in 1949, Newfoundland becomes a province of Canada, and later called Newfoundland and Labrador. And when Newfoundland entered Canada, though that prefix arrangement, those 6 call areas in Newfoundland and Labrador, continued until 1957, when there was a further change. Also, in 1954, they introduced the VE0 call sign for ships making international voyages. And this is a bit of an innovation. And Canada is one of only a couple of countries that have a specially designated series of call signs for amateur stations that are on ships at sea. One of the others is Liberia. And off the top of my head, I can't remember what any of the others are. But so this is a fairly unique institution. One of the things that was happening at the time is the Royal Canadian Navy was encouraging amateur radio was a pastime. And there were club stations on board some ships. And within the Navy, they sort of took over the VE0N series of call signs. Most of the VE0N calls that were based on ships that were on the East Coast would have had call signs beginning with VE0NE. Those from the West Coast would have been VE0NW something. So I remember vividly as a young ham being very excited at working VE0NEH back in 1976 because VE0s were very few and far between.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of my CFARS days when we would get ships at sea checking in on CFARS frequencies. There was a real unique opportunity to talk to a ship at sea when even just on the CFARS, because they had their own designated suffix on CFARS for ships. So it was nice to we were talking to Golan and Cyprus all the time, but it was nice when you got a ship check-in.
Okay, yes, that would have been a pretty spectacular thing. And even today, a maritime mobile attracts a lot of attention on the air. It's an unusual thing. Now, if you're going to be a Canadian, if you're going to be operating from a ship, you don't need to have a V0 call sign. It's simply an option. It's available.
Yeah, that's an interesting question or debate that sometimes comes up. We obviously understand the maritime mobile standard outside of the high tide watermark and international waters. And if you're traveling, for example, if you're traveling maritime mobile and you enter U.S. waters, then you have to apply the American reciprocal agreement. We understand a lot of that. Mm-hmm. But what constitutes a VE0? What gives you the ability to have a VE0? Because there are ships in Halifax Harbor that have a VE0 call sign, but they're they're docked and they're tied up to the dock, right?
Well, yeah, there's one, and it's an exceptional circumstance. It's supposed to be V0 call signs are supposed to be for ships making international voyages. So you can't get it for your kayak if you're going to be out in the pond. You can't use it, for your sailboat on the lake. The idea is that these are call signs to be used on a ship that is making international voyages. So I can recall one amateur I used to work on a regular basis. I remember his first name was Herman. It was a VO1, and he was on the ferry that ran from North Sydney to Argentia, Newfoundland, and he operated from the ship often, and I worked him from the ship often. So when he was outside the 12-mile limit on the way from Argentia to Sydney, he would operating with his V0 call. But when he got onshore, got within the territorial waters of Canada, he would operate with his VO1 call. So that was his choice. I'm not sure if he was obliged to make that switch over partway through his passage. But the whole idea here is this is for a ship that would be used to make international voyages. So one very good recent example is VE0JS, Jean Socrates. She's a woman who did a solo sailing voyage around the world. She's from BC, but she operated as V0JS during the whole of her, I think it was a 2 or 3 year solo sailing trip around the world.
Is that just a temporary assignment, or do you get to keep that for like a regular call?
I think you get to keep that as long as you have the ship registered to you.
No, interesting. Because I know, I don't know if you know Stanley, D3AAA.
I've certainly heard him on the air a bit.
Yeah, he's on. You hear him, you can't miss him. He's got such a big signal. But he also has a VE0 call, and I've worked him as a VE0 in the past.
Oh yes, okay.
I don't know where he was, but he was. He did check into one of the DX nets that he frequents and with a VE0.
Right. But he really should be using it on his ship when he's making some kind of international voyage.
I'm not sure where he was or what he was up to, but it was interesting to work him. So
well, we don't have to police that.
So now we're up to 1954. We got the VE0s. We're starting to see the formation of calls across Canada. What's the next big milestone we see here?
Well, the next thing that happened in 1957, the Department of Transport decided to reorganize the call signs in Newfoundland and Labrador, and that we now have what we recognize today as being VO1 for the island, the whole of the island, and VO2 for all of Labrador. So this replaced those 6 call areas in Newfoundland and Labrador with just 2. So we've had this system in place for close to 70 years now.
Yeah, I see that there, and I also started to see that the formations of the provinces are all in place here now. And the only thing I don't see on the map are, and maybe we'll get into it, is like the CY zeros and those other special call signs. But maybe you got those queued up for us here.
We are going to be talking about those in a little bit. So the next big change happened in 1977. Yukon amateurs decided they wanted to have a prefix distinct from the Northwest Territories. So up until that point, the Northwest Territories and Yukon had been bunched together in a single call area. So Yukoners petitioned Department of Communications, it was at the time, and they asked for and they got VY1 calls. So anybody who was a VE8 in Yukon Territory was able to switch their call sign to be a VY1 call in Yukon, so they could get the same suffix letters. Now, I do not recall if amateurs in the Yukon had the privilege of retaining their VE8 call or not, but I don't think anybody took it up. I think there was pretty much universal consensus among Yukon amateurs that they wanted to have something distinctive from the Northwest Territories. And
VE9 was still experimental at the time too. That's why they didn't go that far.
Exactly right. So the experimental service, there were still stations being licensed in the experimental service for various non-amateur purposes using those VE9 call signs.
Right.
So the next thing that happened was over 20 years later. Prince Edward Island amateurs decided they wanted to have a distinctive prefix. They wanted to break away from the VE1 that was in the Maritimes, and they wanted to have their own prefix just for the island. And so they got it. In 1990, it was implemented. Now, this is in 1990 when this was implemented. It was very popular among radio amateurs and PEI, but of course there were traditionalist hams who were really attached to their VE1 call signs. So they were given the privilege. You could either change your call sign to VY2, or you could retain your VE1 call and remain on PEI. And there are still a few legacy VE1s on PEI, completely legitimate, but it dates back to this time, back to 1990.
Yeah, I might know one or two of those guys.
Yeah. Oh, there's one very well-known one, Ron V1AIC. He's the repeater frequency coordinator for all the Maritimes, and he's still V1AIC, and I think he's quite happy to stay that way.
There's something special about that VY2 call, though. I went over to the island a year or so ago and operated portable, and I know in Canada we don't necessarily have to append the /VY2 or /V1 whenever we travel outside the province since around this time, 1990s, I think it came into effect. But as soon as I did the VE9 CF stroke Victor Yankee 2, the pilots were crazy because everybody wants either that province or that iota. So it sometimes has a good positive impact especially if you're going out doing DX little portable expedition or whatever you want to call it.
It's certainly a unique prefix, does attract attention, and I think that's one of the things that islanders really like about having such a unique prefix.
Exactly.
All right, so the next change, of course, the New Brunswickers were not about to be outdone by those islanders. When the VY2 prefix was adopted for PEI, there were several New Brunswick amateurs who said, well, what about us? And there was an enterprising fellow who was working in Department of Communications at the time, who was a ham, who understood the issue very, very clearly. And so he worked within the department. This is Jim, VE9 Delta Hotel. He's now VE9 Delta Hotel. He was VE1 Delta Hotel at the time. So he was able to convince the department to change the VE9 call signs that had been issued to the experimental service. He got them to agree to change those call signs to VX9 calls to liberate the VE9 prefix block. And VE9 prefix block became available in 1993. And the way it worked is on the same basis of what happened in PEI. If you were a VE1 and you wanted to stay a VE1, you could keep your VE1 call and continue to reside in New Brunswick, continue to operate from New Brunswick with that call sign. However, if you wanted to change to a VE9 call sign, you had to give up the VE1 call. So for a lot of people, that was a very emotional thing because people do get attached to their call signs. I think call signs are probably the single most emotional thing in amateur radio. And I had this vividly demonstrated for me one day. I was living near Fredericton. I was V9CB at the time, and I pull up into the parking lot of the Kent's Hardware store, and I pull up beside this guy with a New Brunswick license plate with a V1 call sign on it. So I didn't know him, so I went and introduced myself. He looks at my license plate. He says, "Oh, you're one of those guys." Here is 25 years after the change. He was still bitter about it. He saw me as a sellout. Which, anyway, very, again, it gives you a little insight into how emotional this stuff can be. So the large majority of radio amateurs in New Brunswick hold VE9 call signs. There are still a few legacy VE1s running around, and you'll hear them on the air, but for the most part, amateurs have adopted VE9 call. And
yeah, I know a guy near St. John, or not near Fredericton, VE1 Bravo Quebec Charlie.
Oh yes,
yeah, very avid POTA hunter. He always when I'm either out or across in Ontario or something, or working one of the lower bands here, he'll often call me.
Yeah, and he's attached to it, and that's grand. He has a certain identity that's built up with that. He's probably held that call since the 70s, and he's happy to keep it that way. I took advantage of that opportunity when the V9 calls came available to get the contemporary equivalent of my grandfather's call sign. So I was VE9CB for about 30 years, and that was the contemporary equivalent to the VE1CB call sign that my grandfather held in New Brunswick in the 20s and 30s.
That's a nice tie there.
Yeah, that was a way of honoring my grandfather.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the next thing that happened that same year was that the VA calls appeared. Now,
I remember when that happened.
Yes, and so it began in Ontario because one of the things, of course, 2-letter call signs are very much in demand, especially if you've been a ham for a few years. You kind of like to have the seniority that's connoted by having a 2-letter call sign. And of course, Ontario having a very large population, about a third of the national population, VE3 2-letter calls are always in short supply. So it was then Department of Communications, or was it Industry Canada? Anyway, the responsible department in Ontario region had a waiting list of people who wanted 2-letter call signs, and the waiting list was getting out of hand. It was becoming an administrative nightmare because they were getting anxious hams calling all the time, asking, where am I on the list? So they eventually knuckled under and said, well, heck, how about if we create a new prefix just for these guys, and we'll clear off that waiting list? And so they did. They allowed people to get VA3 2-letter call signs for the first time, and of course, when they first showed up in the air, it was a bit of a surprise. Then later, other provinces said, well, how about us? So they started issuing those 2-letter call signs across the country and 3-letter call signs with the VA prefixes across the country. And now they're a part of regular, everyday amateur radio, of course.
Of course, with the exception of the VYs and the Victor Oxford and VE9, we don't have a VA9.
That's right. So there are no VA, VA8, or VA9 calls. The assessment that ISED made at the time, ISED or its predecessor made at the time, was that the demand wasn't sufficient to justify this additional administrative work.
Yeah, we still have 2-letter calls available here in New Brunswick that people can go and get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's going to remain. So right now in New Brunswick, in Prince Edward Island, in Labrador, in Northwest Territories, Nunavut, Yukon, if you're a brand new ham, you can get a 2-letter call sign. In the rest of the country, you can't, because the demand exceeds the supply. In the rest of the country, you have to have been a ham at least 5 years to get a 2-letter call sign, and you have to time your application very, 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 very well. So a few years after this, of course, Nunavut becomes a new territory. Nunavut is separated off from the rest of the Northwest Territories, and at the same time, when that was implemented in 1999, Nunavut was given a new prefix. So most of the VY0s, and there aren't very many of them, most of the VY0s at the time most of the VE8s at the time that were in Nunavut became VY0s with the same suffix letters. There were a couple of club stations and beacons that remained VE8s, but not very many. And of course, Nunavut has a very small amateur population.
Yeah, very small. Yeah.
So finally, another thing that the government did is they created a special series of call signs just for themselves. So the VY9 prefix, you don't hear it on the air very often, is for Government of Canada club stations. And there was, I think, a strategic plan to have ISED or Industry Canada offices all have an amateur radio station on board service as part of an emergency preparedness initiative at the time. And several of the VY9 call signs were used fairly regularly. I remember when I was living in St. John's, VY9NF at the St. John's District Office of Industry Canada was reasonably active. There was another one in Sherbrooke that was reasonably active, and there were a couple of others across the country that were active. There still are not very many VY9 call signs. Most of them are club stations for employees of ISED. There was one at the Communications Research Center in Shirley Bay in Ottawa, and that was really the brainchild of a very well-known fellow, Jack Belrose, V2CV, who passed away a few years ago. And there were a few others. There's one for the David Florida Laboratory of the Canadian Space Agency. That still exists. And so there are a few other VY9s, but they're really not very active.
So I wonder if if I was still running the CFB Shiloh Amateur Radio Club, since it was a Government of Canada institution, if we could have got a VY9 call. I'm assuming we could have got a VY9 call if we wanted one.
I think it's very possible. It's very possible you could have done that.
That would have been interesting.
Yeah, and again, that would attract attention. And of course, the VY9s can be anywhere in the country, and they are anywhere from coast to coast to coast.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think I've ever heard one on the air.
Yeah, I've only heard them on a couple of times, and they're quite rare birds indeed. Now, about this time, I don't have a specific date for it. About this time, the CY9 and CY0 prefixes were adopted as special event prefixes for de-expeditions to St. Paul Island and Sable Island. So they're covered in the current call sign policy, but you'll only see them used for short-term operations. I don't think we're going to see any permanent CY9 or CY0 call signs. If we are going to see permanent call signs on either, it's more likely to be on Sable Island, where there actually is a resident population.
Yeah, there's only 3 people that live there full time, I think.
Yeah, there's people who run the weather station there. There used to be actually a fairly large community of, there were teachers and there were families that were living there and so on. But so Sable, and of course, Sable has now become a national park reserve, and you're probably going to see more people going there on visits, but it's still a very expensive visit. The place to visit, as you well know, Stuart.
Oh yeah, $3,500 for you to go there for my thing. And I just talked to the guys who did the CY0 expedition there not too long ago, and it was a very interesting story they had. And of course, St. Paul is off limits completely unless you have very special permission to go there.
Yeah, it's kind of a dangerous, difficult place to get onto. Well, I guess one of the important limiting factors for St. Paul is if you get in trouble, they don't want to have to evacuate you.
Yeah,
you're really all now. St. Paul is an island in the Cabot Strait, so between Cape Breton Island and Newfoundland. But there used to be a lighthouse there. There used to be actual lighthouse keepers who lived on the island. There even used to be a governor's residence on the island, but those have all fallen to rack and ruin, and there is no There's no permanent habitation on there at all. Just the occasional hams who show up there, and occasionally people working in the fishery might stop there. But you're not supposed to go on St. Paul Island without permission of the Coast Guard.
I watched a YouTube video of some scientists going there the other night, and watching their video, it does appear to be very, very difficult to land. They had to basically anchor offshore and then take a dinghy to shore, and then scramble up the rock face to get to everything, where all the houses and stuff it's all overgrown now. And even the guys on the CY0A expedition who went to St. Paul told me a lot of the buildings there are you can't do anything with them because they leak, and they're deteriorating at an alarming rate because of the salt air and everything. So it's it's a shame. But why only those two though? Like why were they? Do you know why those two?
Well,
single.
The initiative was because they have become separate entities for DXCC. So DXCC, of course, is that marquee operating award sponsored by the ARRL in the U.S. And of course, the ARRL has criteria for what qualifies as a country because of the distinctly separate administration of these two islands they're part of Nova Scotia, but they're administered. They were administered in a very distinct manner. Someone was able to make the argument to DXCC that they should count as separate DXCC entities, and so they have been. They've been separate DXCC entities from Canada since sometime in the 80s, if not before. So it was really the interest in doing de-expeditions there and having a unique call sign to identify that expedition, that was the motivator for having CY9 and CY0 set aside for special event operations from those two islands.
So this brings us up to speed to where we're at today, correct?
Pretty much, yeah. So this is our current situation. So we have prefixes associated with every province and territory. In most provinces, we have two different prefixes. In some provinces and territories, we just have one. Now, I think this is the prefix map that you would recognize today. This is anybody operating the bands. If you hear a VY0, you know they're in Nunavut. If you hear a VA7, you know they're in British Columbia. If you hear a VA2, you know they're in Quebec. However, this can get a little bit confusing when it comes to operating in contests. So, of course, for our own contest, Radio Amateurs of Canada, we have two major contests a year: the Canada Winter Contest and the Canada Day Contest. And the multipliers in those contests are the Canadian provinces and territories. We have 10 provinces, we have 3 territories. Every Canadian knows this. You learned this in grade 1. However, there are several other contests that count Canadian provinces and territories as multipliers. And of course, these particular contests are run by American organizations who have an adorable, typical American ignorance of the rest of the world. So for the ARRL DX contest, the ARRL 10-meter contest, the CQ Worldwide contest, they consider Canada to have 14 provinces. So they distinguish Newfoundland and Labrador as being separate provinces for the purposes of those particular contests.
Oh, of course they do. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, of course they do.
So, I think that's probably rooted in the fact that they have unique prefixes. Now, another group of contests of 4 events, the field day and then 3 contests, the ARRL Sweepstakes Sideband, Sweepstakes CW, and the ARRL 160-meter contest. They use sections of the field organization as multipliers. So the sections of the field organization, they're created for the auxiliary communication service, emergency preparedness, public service kind of thing. The sections are organized in a way solely for those purposes. But for reasons best known to ARRL, for these 4 operating events, they use the sections as multipliers or as exchanges in their contests. So consequently, Ontario is divided into 4. The Northwest Territories and Nunavut are combined into 1. And if you get on in any of these events and you live in any of these areas, or if you're working stations from these areas, you have to be prepared to hear a rather unfamiliar abbreviation for the location.
Yeah, I've worked them with the Golden Horseshoe abbreviation going, okay, that's interesting.
Yes, that's right. And most of us outside Toronto have a different opinion of Toronto and might have a different abbreviation for GH that might not be so polite.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. So now that's so this is the situation we're in right now. This should be familiar to you all. We have 13 provinces. We have 10 provinces and 3 territories. In some contests you're going to hear unusual abbreviations. In particularly Newfoundland and Labrador. There we go. I've got I made a little mistake on my PowerPoint slide here, but what we have, in one province we have 2 different prefixes, and in some contests they count separately. Now we shouldn't consider that the Canadian call sign system is static and is frozen as it is. RAC has made substantial proposals for changes to call sign policy. And you may recall back in 2022, RAC did a survey on call sign policy. It was an online survey. We had a remarkably high number of responses. We had over 2,300 responses from amateurs right across the country. And we asked them basically about every single article of the current call sign policy. Now, the current call sign policy is contained in a document called RIC 9, RIC 9. And it has been more or less in its current form since about 1999. So for over a quarter of a century, we've had this policy. It's had small adjustments since then, but throughout that entire time, it's been marked right on the front page as being provisional. So that means to me subject to change. So following I took on the job of being the regulatory affairs officer for RAC in 2022, and in the first CARIB meeting, that's the first Canadian Amateur Radio Advisory Board meeting, where RAC and I said get together to discuss priorities. I made a presentation about the current call sign policy and said how it's not quite fit for purpose, how we need to make some modifications to the way it works. And then we conducted our survey in 2022, and then we made a formal presentation to CARIB in 2023, and I've reiterated it in the two CARIBs since then. So what we're proposing to do is to retain the existing call area. So anybody who becomes a new amateur, they'll get a call sign that fits their region just as we have right now. But we're hoping to make some expansions here. We do want to add the VA8 and VA9 to the Northwest Territories in New Brunswick. We want to expand the use of the the VO numerals in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we want to expand the use of the VY numerals in Nunavut, Prince Edward Island, and Yukon. We also want to allow for growth. We would like to add the VB prefix to the VA-VE call areas because particularly in Ontario, but also in British Columbia and Quebec, in not too many years, we're going to be exhausting the current supply of VA and VE calls. Now, our current policy also dedicates a lot of the Canadian resource. Like Canada has 24 blocks of call signs allocated to us under the ITU. We're using 4 of them for regular issue amateur radio call signs. We're using 16 for special events and special prefixes. I mean, it's what we have here is a situation where the tail's wagging the dog. Special events and special prefixes are nice, but to dedicate 3/4 of your resource to an interesting activity, but not a dominant activity, it seems to be a misplacement. So we're proposing to limit the number of special prefixes to 2 alternates per call area, and to set aside 2 blocks of call signs for special event calls. We also want to change the rules on who can get a 2-letter call sign. So we'd like you to have at least your advanced and 10 years of service in amateur radio. So that would be a significant increase over the current requirement. We'd also like to have a situation where we have to renew the registration of our call signs every 5 years. So in about 2000, Industry Canada, I said, change the rules so that we no longer had to renew licenses every year. They created basically we always had certificates that were good for life. And what I said did is they simply combined the call sign with the certificate and it say that's good for life. So as it is right now, the call signs that you and I hold will remain allocated to us under the current rules until our 125th birthday.
Yeah, I found that rather odd when I took my break from ham radio as VE6 SRC in the late 90s. And then when I called ISED in the early 2020s to get back into it, they said, yeah, your call sign's still good, although you can't have the VE6 anymore. No, I'll talk about that in a second with you. But right. I found it odd that that was still registered to me after all those years of being dormant.
Well, from the point of view of the administrators of the amateur radio service, they see a call sign a little bit like a social insurance number, right? It's a unique identifier for an individual. And that's really what a call sign is right now. We amateurs attach an awful lot of importance to the call signs and the call areas and so on. So we have a situation where if somebody passes away and nobody tells ISED, their call sign will stay on the books until their 125th birthday. So in my case, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, my call sign stays in the books until 2085.
Kind of sounds like the American Social Security strategy. Nobody tells the government, they still send you money.
Well, I suppose, yeah. Well, many strange things happen there. What we proposed is a system where it continues to be a lifetime certificate. However, you have to renew the registration of your call sign every 5 years by a simple online process.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
That's, so they're hoping this is a way of refreshing the call sign database so that because right now we have we have a lot of ghosts, a lot of phantoms in our database. I reckon about 7% of all the call signs in the amateur radio in the current ISET database are allocated to people who already passed away, but nobody told ISET. So by having to renew the registration every 5 years, we're hoping that will free up some of these call signs.
How pertinent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now the next one. Now you got my attention with the next one, because that was a question I was going to ask you. Because as a contester, I would like to get a 2x1 call that I own for as long as I want, and this really got my attention.
Okay, well, these are the two things that we proposed are to use the C and the X blocks of call signs. The CF, CG, CH, CI, and so on, and the X prefixes XK, XL, XM, and then XO. All the C and the X prefixes allocated to Canada, to use those for 2 new series of call signs. And those 2 new series of call signs would be sort of format like CF1AA. A 2-letter call sign could be available if you have your advanced and you've got 10 years of service in amateur radio. You could be available. You could acquire that call sign, and it would have complete portability. Because contesters are one group of people who have a real interest in call signs, especially having an unusually prefixed call sign. But you also have people like you and like me who have mobile careers. I mean, I've lived in 5 provinces, and I have dutifully changed my call sign with every move.
Yeah,
you've done the same thing.
Of course.
Some people, I would have preferred to have a permanent option. However, I realized that this was the price of moving around. So and I've complied with this, but some people are a little bit more begrudging about this. And there really is a good case for people in mobile careers like the armed forces, the federal civil service, all sorts of careers are mobile careers. To be able to take your call sign with you when you move from one place to another would be a bonus for some. So to allow complete portability of a call signs with these aberrant calls, the C's and the X's would be different from the V's, and therefore they would be mobile in our system. So we'd allow 2-letter call signs for people with advanced plus 10 years of service, 1-letter suffix call signs for those who hold all amateur qualifications, which means advanced plus more plus 10 years. And again, both of these would be completely portable.
I like that idea. I even actually, in a conversation I had with ISET a couple of years back, I said, gee, if you guys ever opened up like a 2x1 call available, you guys can generate a whole bunch of extra money for the government, because I know a lot of hands would pay good money to get that call.
They might do. Yeah, you consider I think most people will stick with their existing call sign, but there's going to be a small portion of people who would be highly motivated to have one of these.
Especially the contest crew, like those guys always like that kind of stuff. So that's very. Who knows when we're going to see that, but it's nice to see it on the agenda at least.
Yes. Now, the way we presented this to ISET are naturally non-committal about this, because this would involve some substantial dedication of resources on their part. And right now, they're a little shy of resources. RAC is looking at ways in which we could handle, administer, manage this transition for them. I think ISET looks at the changes that we're proposing, and their first thought is, if we do implement this, we'd have to go through a public consultation process, and that's onerous on them. And then the implementation would also be somewhat onerous, although there are only a few things here that actually require the IT resources necessary to make them to implement them. And again, RAC may be able to fill the gap with that. We've modeled a couple of trial possibilities for how we could manage some of this. So it may happen. It may take a few more years. I'm patient. I'm going to stick with this job, and I'm going to pursue this. I'm sticking with this job with RAC as the regulatory affairs officer, and I'm going to continue to pursue this until they finally say no to me. And
I don't know who else would do it with the same level of due diligence that you have, Dave.
I've worked on this. I've thought about this for a long time, and I'm usually pretty patient on this stuff. So ISET has actually been sympathetic to the idea, and they understand. And I've chosen a few little examples that they've really found profoundly embarrassing. And that can also be a bit of a motivator. So I'm hoping with a bit more time, and when ISET sorts out some of its resource issues, we can see the implementation of this. So this is one of 3 really important tasks that requests that ISET has made, or that RAC has made of ISET over the last few years. It's the changes in updating the call sign policy in this way, The second one is updating the advanced question bank, which we've provided detailed recommendations for that. And the third one is some modifications to allow more widespread use of remotely controlled stations. So those are our three regulatory priorities right now, and we're just waiting for ISED to come up with the resources to implement them all.
So I have some follow-up questions if it's time for those.
Sure.
So a couple of things that are I don't know, bees in my bonnet or clarification that I have. One is the ability for anyone. So if I'm here in New Brunswick and I want to get a VE6 call, and I would go back and the legacy of my Victor Echo 6 days, right?
Right.
All I really need to do that is a mailing address. No proof of residency or anything like that. Do you find that to be another way that some calls? I know guys have 4 or 5 different calls just because they have mailing addresses in different provinces. And you and I have talked about this before too, with Americans.
There's one guy in Cape Breton who holds 20 different VA1 and VE1 call signs.
Yeah. So that means
he's an order.
Yeah. So there's people that hoard call signs. And there's a lot of Americans who have Canadian calls because, they have an address up here, but they don't live here. Is there anything on the future that you can see that may help, slow that down or change in that department?
I'm not sure this is a problem. I think the number of foreign citizens who hold Canadian call signs is relatively few in number. And the number of Canadians who hold multiple call signs, well, I think they're fairly numerous. But, like when somebody changes from one call sign to another, they like to hold on to the old one, mostly to make sure nobody else uses it.
Well, it's that attachment you talked about earlier, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We get really emotionally wound up in these things. I'm not sure if it's a problem. I mean, if we do the implementation of what RAC has proposed, it is not a problem. Basically, we have an abundant source of call signs that we can employ, more than we could ever fill up. As it is right now, if just the 2-letter call signs that we're proposing with the C and the X prefixes, there would potentially be over 90,000 of those.
Oh, so we got lots of space then to play with.
Lots of space. Even the 1-letter suffix call signs, there'll be something over about 4,000 of those available. So it's not, I think we can. I don't think we're in any great shortage of them. Now, also, one of the other rules that we have that's been around for a long time is that you can only hold 1 2-letter call sign. Now, some people hold more than one, but they were grandfathered. They held them from before. As well, 2-letter call signs cannot be assigned to clubs. The clubs that have 2-letter call signs can retain them, but no new 2-letter call signs will be assigned to clubs. So 2-letter call signs and the proposed 1-letter call signs are strictly for individuals, not inanimate objects.
Gotcha.
So that's another thing that sort of keeps the focus where really it should be. So there's a plentiful supply of 3-letter call signs. We considered this in the survey and asked people what they thought about people being allowed to hold multiple call signs and what should an appropriate limit be. And we got answers that were all over the map. And I'm not sure, if we wanted to limit somebody to holding only a certain number of individual call signs, I'm not sure what that limit should be and why. How would you justify a limit? Why should it be 2? Why should it be 1? Why should it be 5? Why should it be 10? I don't know.
I mean, I can see my friend Stuart Hayes, VE3RGO, has VE1RGO, but he has a place in Nova Scotia that he goes to for 6 months of the year. I think that could be, okay, you got to have a physical, residency, either it's a cottage or something. I don't know. And like you said, it's not a problem. So why even?
I hold a VO2 call. I don't live in Labrador, but I operate from Labrador fairly regularly.
Yeah, there you go. So,
I hold a U.S. call. I don't live in the U.S. I hold a British call. I don't live in Britain.
Well, you have called me with your British call when you work remote, though, into Britain.
That's right. Yeah. So that's been kind of fun. But there was there are different circumstances why I chose to get those call signs. I'm not sure if this is a problem.
Yeah, not yet. Anyway, maybe one day, who knows? But if it becomes a problem, then that's a good thing for amateur radio.
Yes, that's right.
So my other point of contention, it's not a contention in Canada, but maybe you can address it, is our friends down south. Mm-hmm. So they have made a mess of their call sign system. There was a day, I remember when I first got licensed, if you had a 1 call, you were in New England.
Yes.
And if you were a 6, you were in California or on the West Coast. Now you could be a 1 in California and a 6 in New England.
Yeah.
Dave, I sure hope that everything that's holy and goodness in this world, that Canada doesn't follow that exemption or that example.
I think, a lot of Canadian amateurs look upon what they did in the United States with shock and horror. And you've just expressed that. I don't think we like that. So I think retaining the existing call areas is something that I think rings true with a lot of Canadians. So if you do move, you can change your standard, VA call sign as appropriate. So this is, that was one of the things that motivated us to go to the C's and the X's as being aberrant, separate from that regular series, and therefore agnostic as to region. So, this is a great time to be critical of the United States simply because their leadership is beating up on our country. I'm not sure if it's necessarily that big a problem. I hear people whining and moaning about this all the time. I think we just have to accept that this is the way it's been done in the United States for 40 years, almost 50 years. Build a bridge and get over it.
Yeah.
So
the biggest challenge I see is you're looking at the DX cluster, right? And you see a ZL spotted by a Kilo 1. And you go, oh gosh, ZL is getting into New England, right? Maybe I can hear him. And then you look on QRZ and find out he's in Los Angeles.
So that's your biggest problem.
That's one of them.
Sounds pretty small to me.
It is pretty.
You're mildly disappointed that you can't hear the station that you thought you could hear.
In the grand scheme of things, yeah, it's very small, but
maybe just sit down, have a cup of tea, and then have a pause for a bit, and then go back to it.
There we go. But yeah, it's I guess it's grand scheme of the world, it's not that big of a deal, right? So I just like the way our system works in other countries, where if you're working at VE9, 99.9% of the time that guy's going to be in New Brunswick.
Yeah.
Or a Papa Yellow 2 is going to be in a certain area of Brazil.
But there are many countries that have never had call areas. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you think of all the other radio services, in Canada at least, there's no other radio service that has call areas. None.
Wow.
Not broadcasting, not the land mobile service. None of them have call areas. Just us. And we have call areas because we've had call areas since 1927. And we're attached to that. So it's habit that's almost become constitution in a way. Like Germany, never. France, never. Britain, sort of, but not really.
I know some of them use different prefixes and calls based on level of life.
Yes.
Yeah. So every country's a little different, right? We talked about that in the DARF presentation, where sovereign nations are free to do whatever they like.
That's right. Now there are some general rules, and we stick to them. But
this is great. I'm sure it gives people a lot of good foundation of why we do things the way we do in our great country.
Yeah, I say there's no one right way to do things, but I think we've had a pretty good system here, and I think we can stand a little bit of modification now and again. So we'll try.
Works for us. So Dave, I want to give you an opportunity, one more chance before we wrap up today. Just give us a quick plug for the work you guys are doing with the Defensive Amateur Radio Fund, because I always think that needs to be mentioned.
Okay, well, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I always like to take an opportunity to this. I think that just not just Canadians, but amateurs around the world, if there's one thing you can do to help support amateur radio, it's to be a member of your National Amateur Radio Society. In Canada, it's RAC. In the United States, it's ARRL. In Britain, it's the RSGB. In France, it's REF. Be a member of that national society and support it, because part of the work that they do is to advocate for your interests, and nobody's going to do it better than your national society, and you're not going to do it better by sitting in your hands and keeping those few dollars to yourself. One of the things we have in Canada that's really remarkable is we have a very good working relationship with our regulator. So good, in fact, that RAC nominates a person to sit on the Canadian delegation to the World Radio Conferences, where they decide on frequency allocations and radio regulations worldwide. So that gives us an opportunity to be in the room when the decisions are made. So there is a fund that RAC has created called the Defensive Amateur Radio Fund that is there to pay the expenses of that Canadian radio amateur who's on the Canadian delegation to these WRCs. The work involved is continuous. So you may have seen from the previous discussion you and I had, Stuart, Paul Coverdale, V3ICV, is that person right now. Paul is in Geneva at the moment, and for a WRC related conference that's preparing for WRC that will happen next year in Shanghai. Spending a few days in Geneva is not cheap, and he's not going to be able to do it on his own hook. So if we can contribute money to the Defensive Amateur Radio Fund, we can help support the work that Paul does to represent our interests. And again, being a member of RAC, being a member of your national society, the way it works is the IRU is our international representative. RAC is the member society for Canada. In our region of the world, in Region 2, RAC pays membership fees to IRU based on the number of amateurs in Canada, not based on our membership, but based on the number of amateurs in Canada. So you and I, who are members of RAC, are paying the freight, paying the dues for 9 other people who are not members of RAC. We're paying the cost of that representation. So, do the right thing, share the burden, and help support the organization that represents your interests. So
every little bit helps, right? Every little helps. Even I was talking to Auntie the other day, and I applied for the Workdoll Rack Award, and I said it's $5 for the digital or $10 for the print one. I said, well, the digital one's fine. It's all I need. But $5 is fair because I know that money's going to go into the bigger pool for all the work that RAC does for us. And that's very, very important. Dave, thanks for taking some time out of your morning to come and talk to us about this, very important subject about Canadian call signs. I'm sure there's a lot of people that lie awake at night thinking about this, but it's always great to have a good history lesson about where we came from, where we started, and where we're at today. I know you and I have got some other presentations in the works, some new tower legislation or rules that are going to be coming out soon, or in the middle of getting discussed, that could have some big impacts on the amateur radio population here in Canada. And I'm always thinking about different things to share. Always need a reason to have a good hour-long conversation with you.
It's always a pleasure, Stuart. Thank you very much for having me again, and I look forward to the next time. Take care.
And don't forget to go to rac.ca, and if you're not a member of Radio Amateurs Canada here, and you're a Canadian amateur, or hey, you're outside of Canada, you want to support us, we'll be more than happy to take your money.
Yeah, it costs $1 a week.
$1 a week. That's not bad. And the TCA magazine is probably one of the better ones I've seen out there. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I'm Stuart, Victor Echo 9, Charlie Foxtrot, and we thank Dave again for joining us. And we'll see you guys in a future episode. See you later, everyone.